right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of the IT ProTV podcast. I'm your host, Don Pezet, back again with, well, another episode, and we're going to be focusing on security in this one because, well, you know, we have just been jam-packed with security news lately. The Equifax breach keeps getting bigger and bigger. They announced some 1.5 million people have been added onto the list of breach candidates on that one, so it just keeps getting worse and worse. And so I've got a special guest here in the studio, or at least digitally in the studio with me. I've got Art Gilliland, CEO of Skyport Systems, who is joining us. Art, thanks for being in studio with us.
It's my pleasure, Don. Thank you very much for having me.
And Skyport Systems, you know, they have an interesting solution that basically is designed to help sit in between our cloud infrastructure and our on-premises infrastructure to help protect us from these types of breaches that really, you know, the attackers get a foothold into an environment and then they just start getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and it really creates a challenging environment for us to protect from. So before I get ahead of myself, Art, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself to our viewers, kind of let them know who you are, and tell us just a little bit about Skyport Systems.
Thank you, Don. So my name is Art Gilliland, as he said. I've been in the security industry for about 17 years. I actually tripped over security on accident at a startup. That company was acquired by Symantec. I spent about 6 years at Symantec, ultimately running their information security business. And then joined Hewlett-Packard to run their security business for a number of years before joining Skyport in 2015 as their CEO.
So in this particular case, you know, we keep talking about Equifax because the attack, it keeps evolving. We keep learning a little bit more about it. And you had an interesting quote that you released about how it wasn't just one hacking team that got into this one, that were actually more than one involved. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think obviously we're going to learn more and more over time as more research happens. That's always true for every breach. You never know exactly what happened at the beginning. But one of the really interesting things that came out recently is that they're connecting it to nation-state attackers. And the part of the story that I found most interesting was that the nation-state attackers essentially just contracted with a bunch of other entities to break in, and so they're finding evidence of multiple different kinds of adversaries breaking in. And then what those break-in artists did is then just handed off the access points to much more sophisticated professionals, if you will, to actually do the damage and map out the environment and find the assets or data they were looking for, and then be able to exfiltrate or steal that data from Equifax. And so that sort of separation of duties, if you will, in the process, the fact that there is a step-by-step process and that there were multiple different actors, if you will, probably some cyber criminal gangs, nation states, as well as just sort of for hire attackers, I think is a pretty typical example of what a lot of enterprises face, and Equifax is just the latest painful example of that.
Now, a lot of people are really quick to blame Equifax for this. You know, it's their fault. They should have patched. But I think we really have to have a better understanding of the timeline, you know, what this attack looked like before we can figure out exactly who's to blame. Because, yeah, they very well could be at fault. They may not have patched in a reasonable amount of time, or maybe the attack was so aggressive. So what's your take on that timeline?
The adversary really only has to be right one time, and you have to be right all the time. And so that's one of the challenges. And I'm sure that Equifax made mistakes, but I think the reality is that from the time that this vulnerability was disclosed to the time that they were infiltrated, it was about 2 to 3 months. And that sounds like a lot of time. But when you're a billion-dollar company with infrastructure all over the place, getting all of that stuff patched as fast as possible is complicated, especially if there's other projects that are going on. And so you don't expect to be attacked, although you should. Companies just, I think, struggle with responding as fast, because this is just one of the vulnerabilities that they hear about every single week. On Tuesday, Microsoft is going to train people. More vulnerabilities are coming out. Get out there and patch everything. But it's hard to keep up with all this stuff.
Yeah. Now, as a business, I know one of the challenges that people are facing is that in the olden days, we had data centers, right? So if you had a business, all of your servers were right there in your own data center. You kind of had a gateway, an entry point. You knew how people entered your network. You knew how people exited your network, and you were able to monitor those points and see when there was malicious activity or just unusual activity, right? You had that visibility to be able to see it. But in today's world, things have become a lot more complex, that now we've got these hybrid networks where, yeah, maybe I have my on-premises servers, but I've got some servers in Amazon Web Services, or I've got web applications, containerized web applications that might be in more than one cloud service reaching back to local databases. Now that network becomes a lot more nebulous, right? We don't have that boundary anymore that is a kind of a single point where we can monitor and see when these attacks go on. So I know that that's one of the areas that you specialize in and that Skyport has a solution in. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, when you think about what's changed for companies, is the cloud has really massively changed the way in which people think about consuming services or consuming infrastructure. And so almost every company that we talk with has some of their services and infrastructure coming from the cloud, whether it's SaaS services or infrastructure that they're just renting from Amazon or Google or Microsoft. And then that's connecting back into data centers or sort of smaller computing locations that they have in their environment. And so that connection, that permanent sort of connection back and forth between someone else's infrastructure and your infrastructure is sort of the heart of where Skyport spends its time. In particular, the connections in between those two places have just changed. And they've changed the requirements. Most of the interaction that happens between an external service and an internal application is managed by an application, managed by a gateway, if you will. And the way in which those things connect, the types of traffic that they use between applications and applications are different than what firewalls and typical perimeter technology are used to dealing with. And so we offer and work with customers to help make that connection a lot more manageable, a lot easier to deal with, and more flexible, and more secure.
Now, I know, let's say that I have a web application that is deployed and it's in AWS, right? So Amazon Web Services, and I'm leveraging their virtual private cloud. So we've created this partition network for the web application. We've exposed it to the world, right? We need the customers to be able to get to it. But it's got a phone home. It's got to be able to reach out to my on-premises databases, or at a minimum, my employees need to be able to get to it securely. So I know that services like the AWS VPCs, you can build a VPN tunnel up. You can have where your hardware has a secure tunnel, and if an attacker were to get into that, that would be really bad. But what you're saying is that the tunnel is not enough. There's still more risk to be found there.
That's right. I mean, I think the reality is that tunnel, for the most part, is an encrypted street, if you will, for all of the data from the cloud to move into and connect to your own data center. And I think the challenge that a lot of customers face with that is that starts in Amazon to an externally facing application. That application itself is vulnerable. Amazon is secure and the infrastructure you're running on is secure, but that application you put up there is not typically secure. And so now you have this relatively insecure application. In this case, let's say the Equifax breach had a Apache web server up there with the struts vulnerability on it. You could attack that infrastructure in Amazon and get access to that application. And if you've created a VPC or that encrypted tunnel back into your data center, now the adversary literally has an encrypted tunnel all the way through all of your network security infrastructure back to the application you connected it to. Because most customers and most organizations actually terminate that encrypted tunnel in the heart of their data center. And so essentially what they've done is they've made all of their network security investment irrelevant because they've gone through it in an encrypted way, and the adversary has literally a protected tunnel into the heart of the data center. And so what we are working with customers to do is to run that application, that gateway application that connects to the cloud, and terminate the encrypted tunnel that you correct, because I think those VPC tunnels are powerful, but terminate it in a place that allows you to secure it. You used to terminate that at the edge of your network in the DMZ, but customers and companies just aren't doing that now. They're terminating in the heart of their data center. And if you're going to do that, you need to terminate it in a secure enclave, and that's what Skyport delivers to customers.
So how is it handling that? Like, how is it sanitizing that data? Is this a behavioral or heuristic scan? Is it a whitelisting? What type of activities are you performing to make sure that that data is safe, or that the types of
Yeah,
traffic on that line is safe?
it's actually much simpler than that. If you think about the historic DMZ in a network, it was essentially the edge of your environment connecting out, and then another edge on the other side connecting in. So it really was a safe zone, or a quote unquote zone that was protecting you from the outside, and then controlling connections out and controlling connections in. And what we're doing is we run an application in an enclave, basically a logical or specific segment of your network. You put an application in it, and we draw a perimeter around that thing, no matter where it is. So you don't have to have firewalls, you don't have to have proxies, you don't have to have a bunch of that other technology, because it's all built in as a software-defined environment. And so these things can be deployed in a branch office, they can be deployed in the heart of your data center without making a lot of really sophisticated and difficult changes in your environment, and we can completely isolate the applications that run in it. And so it's essentially building a perimeter or a network zone that's specific to that one application, and protecting everything, not only protecting it from everything around it, but protecting everything around it from the thing that you're running.
I'm glad you mentioned it that way. I'm reminded of the first time that I set up an AWS connection like that. I'm an Amazon guy. I've worked with Microsoft Azure and Google Compute, but AWS is kind of that market leader. The first time I set up a VPC private connection like that, it was a nightmare. Like they only supported one routing protocol, and that was BGP. And BGP is just not a user-friendly routing protocol. They only supported certain hardware, so you had to have particular Cisco firewalls or whatever to be able to build that connection up. So it wasn't easy. And because it wasn't easy, a lot of people didn't do it, which put them at risk. And so you said, like with Skyport, is this it's an appliance or a software appliance that you deploy? What does that look like in a deployment model to make it easy?
Yeah, so we are an appliance, and so we're essentially, it's interesting, we are following almost the exact same sort of service model that an Amazon or an Azure would follow, in that we're delivering a service to our customers, and it happens to run in an appliance that runs in your environment. But it's completely cloud managed, so there's no software to deploy, nothing to upgrade or update. We manage all of that maintenance and operations to protect the platform, so that you are guaranteed a secure platform. And if anything fails ever, we just replace the appliance for you. And so all you have to worry about as a customer is, what app do you want to deploy? And you can run anything you can virtualize, you can run in us. And then what policies do you want to enforce? And so literally you can get our system, our appliance, in a box at your door, and in about 20 minutes from uncrating it to plugging it in, you can be moving workloads into it. And it includes the hypervisor, the storage, the networking, the security technologies, and all of the analytics to be able to manage and run that infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think this stuff is really important, because it has been a challenge in the past, and you don't want there to be obstacles to good security, and that's, I think, what we've really had. And we've seen more and more, even not recently, right? The Target compromise, when they had their credit card databases, or not databases, just their credit card traffic was all intercepted and relayed. That was all done through a single weak network, right? Through their, I believe it was their HVAC or air conditioning network.
Right.
That then turned into a giant leapfrog attack, that once they got in at that one little spot, then the attackers were able to get all the way to the cash register, which was really, really bad. So having something in between, that's really handy. Now, how do you handle services where, maybe we've tried to diversify across the cloud? So I've got a web application that's deployed in Azure and AWS. How would you handle that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of times customers are creating those connections, or they're routing them back into a data center. They're controlling the data path between them and routing it back into it. And we would just be a place for routing the connections. If you're connecting from an application that's sitting in your own data center into two different front ends, that to us is just a different path or a different route. So it is almost irrelevant where you run your services. If it's connecting back into your environment, we are the place you want to land that traffic.
Awesome. Well, it's definitely an area that needs to be addressed. I'm glad there's companies like yours that are out there to provide us that layer of protection and ultimately to make it easy, because that's really a big challenge that we bump into. Now, I know that Skyport does more than just that. That's your primary focus, but what are some of the other things that you guys deliver?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what that platform is, it's a way to securely isolate the applications that you're running. And so obviously a really important one is the connections outside and inside, because you want to make sure you're controlling the communications that's happening there. But there are a couple of other places where people are using this also. One of them is, if you think about what cloud has done, is it's made your network a lot more porous. And so you have really high value assets, things that you use to set the rules in your environment, things like Active Directory or DNS or those key signing servers. And so what customers are using us for is to isolate or create a secure enclave for those types of systems too. Active Directory tends to be one of the most important and the one that they do the most. And so that's one side. And if you sort of flip that on its head and think about those as the critical things you want to protect from the general environment, there's also these ugly old applications that run in your environment that you want to protect everything else from. You still have to have them because they drive revenue or money, but they were written on an old platform like Windows 2003 or old versions of Linux. And so legacy applications or out of compliance applications or other kinds that you want to enclave off. And so that's another place that people use us. It's essentially the same technology of creating a secure landing spot and controlling traffic in and out. Micro segmentation starter kit is probably a good way to think about it. But you do that for these critical apps. You do it for these legacy apps. But primarily, it's at your network perimeter. It's creating sort of virtualizing your DMZ or virtualizing your perimeter.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Active Directory. That is an area where you've got very sensitive data, user credentials, and a lot of people, they stand up a domain controller and they assume that Microsoft's done everything we need to make sure that data is secure and safe. And the reality is that domain controllers have inherent weaknesses and that they expect all machines to be able to connect to them and start throwing LDAP requests at it. And that can be a big vulnerability, one a lot of people don't look at. And the other problem is domain controllers are normally being accessed by internal hosts. So it's not like you've got a whole lot of firewalls there or anything that's protecting or even inspecting that data. So that is an area that's weak. Even if you're not connected to the cloud at all, just internally, we've got that kind of a problem. So can you
see that setup? You see that challenge, and Microsoft does give people advice on how to set it up, but that advice itself is also like 250 pages. So customers struggle to maintain the best practice, if you will, with Active Directory for the reason that it's an incredibly complex application that touches everything. But it also are the keys to the kingdom, essentially.
Yeah. All right. Well, to try and summarize it here, when we have a web-facing application, there's always going to be risk. There's always going to be vulnerabilities because it's exposed to the public. But if we take care and protect our assets that are in the local environment, if we secure that tunnel between our web-facing customer application and our back-end data, we can really improve security and prevent attacks like these. So for our viewers, if they want to learn more about Skyport, where can they go?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, if you want to learn about Skyport, the best place to go is to our website, skyport.com, skyportsystems.com. And so that would be probably the best place. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Skyport Systems on LinkedIn. And we publish a lot of technical blogs and things like that, talking about some of the changes that we see coming. Whether it's how cloud is changing the perimeter or the impact of encryption on security technologies. And so there's a lot of learning and not a lot of marketing stuff, mostly just technical learning types of documentation that we'd like to publish on that channel. So that would be one good place, or go to skyportsystems.com.
Yeah, definitely a great way to go and learn about some of the things that are going on and see one of the possible solutions that are out there. Definitely a really neat one. It's such a complex world now that we have the software-defined networks, we have cloud services, that there is no just single data center that you have to protect. It makes things really challenging. So it's an area that people really need to keep their eyes on. And as long as we continue to be weak in that area, we're going to see more and more breaches like these where they're just not being contained. And you might not be able to stop the breach, but at least you can contain it once it happens if you've got the protection measures in place. Well, Art, I really do appreciate you spending time with us. I know our viewers do too. Do you have any parting words you want to mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I would sort of just offer up on the security side of it is one of the biggest challenges that customers are facing is managing the basics. And so what you see in Amazon and cloud and a lot of these services is this idea of shared responsibility. And we believe that shared responsibility is going to come into the infrastructure that you run in your own data center. And that's why we went on we embarked on Skyport systems, where you're still going to need to run local systems, but shared responsibility where the vendor is responsible for making sure that their products are secure and up to date is, I think, a way that we're going to be able to radically reduce the security breaches that occur. And so taking off the burden of managing the infrastructure so you can focus on your applications and your policy. That's the benefit of cloud. That's the benefit of cloud managed infrastructure. And we hope that will make a big difference in the environment.
Excellent. Well, like I said, I really do appreciate having you on the show. And if you guys want to learn more about them, go to skyportsystems.com. Check out their website. It's really good information to be had right there. But we are out of time for this episode, so we're going to wrap this one up. Thank you all for watching, and be sure to check back as we have more episodes of the ITProTV podcast coming out on a regular basis. Lots of good information to be covered there. We focused on security in this episode, but know that we cover a lot of different topics, and if you have suggestions, feel free to reach out to us on our social media channels and other avenues of communications. But as always, I do appreciate you guys watching. Signing off for ITProTV, I've been your host, Dom Pezet, and I will see you next time.